I found out I owned a farm when the county sent me a foreclosure notice for property taxes I'd never heard of. Before we dive into this wild story, hit subscribe while you're here. Tomorrow, I'm dropping something that'll leave you absolutely speechless. I was 18 years old, 3 weeks out of Parkside Group home, living in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. I'd been working double shifts at a diner trying to save enough for community college when the envelope arrived. Official letterhead, County Tax Assessor's Office. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Final notice, property taxes delinquent on parcel 14-23-09. Total owed $3,217.63. Foreclosure proceedings to begin in 30 days. I read it 3 times, my hand shaking. There had to be a mistake. I didn't own property. I'd never owned anything more valuable than the 10-year-old laptop I'd bought at a pawn shop. But there was my name, clear as day, Riley Foster, and an address in Millbrook County, about 90 miles north. I called the number on the letter, expecting them to tell me it was an error, that someone with a similar name was the actual owner. Instead, the woman who answered pulled up my file and confirmed what the letter said. "You inherited the property 4 years ago," she explained. "Henderson Farm, 43 acres. The previous owner was Margaret Henderson. According to our records, you're listed as her sole heir." Margaret Henderson. The name hit me like cold water. My mother's mother. The grandmother I'd met exactly twice before she cut all contact with us. "That's impossible," I said. "She hated my mother. She wanted nothing to do with us." The woman's voice softened slightly. "I can't speak to family matters, but the deed was transferred to you when you turned 14, held in trust until you reached 18. The trust should have been covering the taxes, but the account ran dry 2 years ago. If you can't pay the outstanding amount, the county will seize the property." After I hung up, I sat on my threadbare couch, trying to make sense of it. My mother had died when I was 13, cancer that came fast and brutal. I barely remembered my grandmother, just a tall, severe woman who'd visited our cramped apartment once when I was 7, argued with my mom behind closed doors, and left without saying goodbye. The second time was at my mother's funeral, where she'd stood apart from everyone, watching from a distance. She'd approached me once, pressed something into my hand, and whispered, "When you're old enough, you'll understand." Then she was gone. I'd forgotten about that moment until now. I went to the shoebox where I kept my mother's few belongings and found it. A small iron key, old and heavy, with a tag attached. On the tag, in faded ink, "Barn, East Wall, when you're ready." The next morning, I called in sick to work, borrowed my neighbor's car, and drove north. The GPS led me through increasingly rural roads until I turned onto a gravel driveway choked with weeds. A tilted mailbox read Henderson. The farm was exactly what the tax notice had described. Forgotten. The main house was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and broken shutters. The porch sagged dangerously, and several windows were cracked or missing entirely. Overgrown fields stretched in every direction, reclaimed by wild grass and thistle. But it was the barn that caught my attention. Unlike the house, it stood solid and straight. The red paint had faded to a dusty rose, but the structure itself seemed sound. The doors were secured with a massive padlock, rust-covered and ancient. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. This was crazy. I was about to break into a barn on property I supposedly owned but had never seen before, following cryptic instructions from a dead woman who'd abandoned my mother. The key slid into the padlock like it had been waiting for me. It turned with a grinding protest, and the lock fell open in my hands. The barn doors required both hands to pull open, their hinges screaming in protest. Inside was darkness and the smell of old hay and something else, wood and oil and time. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing what made my breath catch in my throat. The entire barn had been converted into a workshop, not a farming workshop, an artist's studio. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools I didn't recognize. There were easels, some still holding canvases covered with drop cloths. Shelves were crammed with paint supplies, brushes, palettes, and jars of mysterious substances. But it was the paintings that made me freeze. They covered every available wall, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and I recognized the style immediately because I'd grown up surrounded by it. My mother had been a painter, not professionally, just whenever she could afford supplies, usually painting on cardboard or cheap canvas. She'd filled our tiny apartment with her work, landscapes and portraits, and abstract pieces that seemed to capture emotion in color. I'd always thought it was just her hobby, something she did to escape the stress of working 3 jobs to keep us afloat. But these paintings in the barn were clearly done by the same hand, the same bold brushstrokes, the same way of capturing light. Except these were larger, more confident, painted on professional canvases with expensive materials. I walked deeper into the barn, my flashlight revealing more and more. There was a small living area set up in one corner, a cot with neatly folded blankets, a hot plate, and shelves of canned goods. Someone had lived here, at least part-time. On the main workbench, I found a journal. The leather cover was worn smooth, and when I opened it, I recognized my grandmother's handwriting from the few birthday cards she'd sent when I was very young. The first entry was dated 23 years ago, before I was born. Sarah came to the farm today. She's pregnant and terrified. James left her, and she has nowhere to go. I told her she could stay, that we'd figure it out together. She's in the barn right now, painting. It's the first time I've seen her smile in months. I flipped through more entries, my hands trembling. The journal documented my mother's pregnancy, my birth, the first years of my life spent on this farm. But there was tension, too. Arguments. My grandmother's entries grew frustrated. Sarah wants to leave. She says the farm is suffocating her, that she needs to be in the city where she can sell her work, make a real life for Riley. I don't understand. We have everything here, but she's determined. The entries stopped abruptly when I was 4 years old. The last one simply said, "She left today." Took Riley with her, said I was too controlling, that she needed to raise her daughter her own way. Maybe she's right. Maybe I held on too tight to both of them. But there were more journals. I found them stacked in a wooden crate under the workbench. My grandmother had kept writing, documenting years of my life that she'd watched from a distance. Riley's teacher called me. I'm still listed as an emergency contact. Sarah's in the hospital. Cancer. They're saying 6 months at most. I went to see Sarah in hospice. She made me promise not to contact Riley directly. Said Riley needed stability, not an old woman she barely knows disrupting her life. But she asked me to keep the farm for her, to make sure Riley has it when she's old enough to understand. Riley's in the group home now. It's killing me not to bring her here, but Sarah's social worker says the state won't approve me as a guardian. Too old, they said. Health issues. The farm is too remote. So I set up the trust instead. Riley will get everything when she turns 18. The house, the land, and the truth. I sat down hard on an old stool, the journals scattered around me. My grandmother hadn't abandoned us. She'd been watching over me the whole time, honoring my mother's wishes, even though it meant staying away. The last journal had entries right up until 4 years ago, around the time the tax trust would have run dry. I'm in hospice now, same cancer that took Sarah. Poetic, I suppose. I've paid the property taxes as far ahead as I could, but the money will run out eventually. When Riley gets the notice, she'll come to the farm, she'll find the barn, and she'll understand that she comes from artists, from women who pour their souls into creation. The farm is hers, but more than that, Sarah's paintings are hers. Our legacy is hers. I wiped tears from my face and stood up, looking around the barn with new eyes. This wasn't just a forgotten farm. It was my history, my mother's sanctuary, my grandmother's gift. I pulled the drop cloths off the easels one by one. Underneath were my mother's paintings, preserved carefully, protected from light and moisture, landscapes of the farm, portraits of my grandmother, and in the corner a series of paintings of me as a baby, a toddler, a child. She'd painted me from memory after leaving, capturing moments I didn't even remember. The paintings were extraordinary, not just technically skilled, but deeply emotional. These weren't the works of a hobbyist. This was the output of a genuine artist who'd never had the chance to share her gift with the world. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. I spent the next 3 days at the farm, sleeping in my car because the house wasn't safe, and cataloging everything in the barn. There were 237 paintings total. Some were my grandmother's work, landscapes mostly, painted in a more traditional style. But the majority were my mother's, and they were remarkable. I took photos of everything and, on a whim, posted a few to social media with a simple caption, "Found my late mother's paintings in a barn. She never got to share her work with anyone." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People shared the post. Art enthusiasts commented about technique and emotion. By the second day, I had messages from gallery owners asking if the paintings were for sale. One message came from a woman named Catherine Torres, owner of a contemporary art gallery in the city. She offered to drive out to see the collection in person. I was skeptical, but I agreed. Catherine arrived in an expensive car, wearing heels completely inappropriate for a farm. But she didn't complain. She walked through the barn for 2 hours, examining each painting with an intensity that made me nervous. Finally, she turned to me. "Riley, these are museum quality. Your mother had extraordinary talent. I'd like to represent her work if you're willing. We could do a retrospective show. The story alone, undiscovered paintings by a gifted artist who died young, will generate significant interest, but the work itself is genuinely exceptional." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Catherine pulled out her phone and started making calculations. "Conservative estimate. If we price appropriately and generate the right buzz, the collection could sell for anywhere from 200,000 to $500,000, possibly more. The barn seemed to tilt around me. That money would change everything. I could pay off the property taxes. I could fix up the house. I could go to college. I could actually build a life instead of just surviving day to day. But as Catherine talked about contracts and commission rates and exhibition schedules, I felt something twist in my chest. These paintings were my mother's soul. They were proof that she'd been more than just the exhausted single mom I remembered, working herself to death to keep us housed and fed. She'd been an artist with dreams and talent, and a whole life before I existed. "Can I think about it?" I asked. Catherine smiled. "Of course, but Riley, don't wait too long. The art world moves fast, and this kind of opportunity doesn't come around often." After she left, I sat alone in the barn, surrounded by my mother's work. In the journals, my grandmother had written about how my mother had wanted to make it as an artist in the city, how she'd struggled to balance that dream with raising me alone, how she'd eventually given up painting entirely to work 3 jobs after getting sick and needing money for treatments. She'd sacrificed her art for me, and now I had the chance to give it back to her, to let the world see what she'd created. But I also needed that money, needed it desperately. I found my answer in the last painting I uncovered, hidden under a tarp in the back corner. It was different from the others. Instead of a landscape or portrait, it was an abstract piece, swirling colors that somehow captured chaos and hope at the same time. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were words I'd never seen before. "For Riley, when you find this, know that I painted for joy, not for recognition. Create your own path, baby girl. Don't let my unrealized dreams become your burden. The farm is yours to do with what feels right. I love you always. Mom." I cried then, really cried, for the first time since she died. Not just for losing her, but for all the years she'd spent being strong for me, sacrificing what she loved so I could have what I needed. I called Catherine the next day. "I'll do the show," I said, "but I want to keep some of the paintings, the personal ones, the ones of me and my grandmother. Those aren't for sale." "That's completely understandable," Catherine said. "In fact, it might make the available pieces even more valuable. Exclusivity matters in this market." Over the next 3 months, Catherine and I worked together to prepare for the exhibition. She had the paintings professionally photographed, framed, and documented. She wrote a catalog essay about my mother's life and work. She pitched the show to major art publications and got coverage in 3 magazines. I used some of the advance money Catherine offered to pay the back taxes and start repairs on the farmhouse. I hired contractors to fix the roof and foundation. I had the electrical system updated and the plumbing replaced. I wasn't sure if I'd live there permanently, but I wanted to preserve it, to honor what it had been to my mother and grandmother. The exhibition opened on a Thursday night in September. Catherine had transformed her gallery into a shrine to my mother's talent. The paintings were beautifully lit, arranged to tell a story, from her early work through her mature period. There was even a small section dedicated to my grandmother's paintings, showing where my mother's influence came from. I wore the nicest dress I'd ever owned, bought specifically for this event, and stood in the corner, feeling completely out of place. The gallery was packed with people I didn't know, collectors and critics and art enthusiasts who'd come to see the work of an artist they'd never heard of before. But they loved it. I watched people spend long minutes in front of individual paintings, getting lost in my mother's vision. I heard conversations about her use of color, her emotional honesty, her technical skill. Critics took notes, collectors placed bids. By the end of the night, 23 paintings had sold. The total was $312,000. I stood there in shock as Catherine hugged me, congratulating me on my mother's success. Our success, really, because this money meant I'd never have to worry about surviving again. I could finish my education. I could restore the farm completely. I could build the life my mother had wanted for me. But more than the money, what mattered was that people had seen her work. They'd recognized her talent. She hadn't died as just another struggling single mom. She'd died as an artist, and now the world knew it. The reviews came out over the following weeks. Every single one praised my mother's work. One critic wrote, "Sarah Foster's paintings reveal an artist of remarkable sensitivity and technical prowess. That she died in obscurity while working multiple jobs to support her daughter is a tragedy, but this exhibition ensures her legacy will endure." I framed that review and hung it in the farmhouse, right next to the painting she'd made for me. With the money from the sales, I finished restoring the property. The house became livable again, painted fresh white with new shutters in deep green. I fixed the porch, replaced the broken windows, and filled the rooms with furniture I bought at estate sales. I kept the barn exactly as it was, my mother's studio preserved like a museum. I moved to the farm permanently 6 months after the exhibition. I enrolled in online classes at the State University studying art history because I wanted to understand my mother's work in a broader context. I also started painting myself, setting up an easel in the barn and working through my own grief and joy on canvas. I wasn't as talented as my mother, at least not yet, but I found the same peace in the process that she must have felt. The act of creating something from nothing, of putting emotion into visual form, connected me to her in a way I'd never experienced when she was alive. I also discovered that I had a good eye for other artists' work. Catherine started asking my opinion on pieces she was considering for the gallery, and eventually she offered me a part-time job as her assistant curator. I'd drive to the city twice a week, help her evaluate new work and plan exhibitions, then return to the farm where I felt most at peace. The community around Millbrook was small but welcoming. My neighbors, mostly farmers and small business owners, were curious about the young woman who'd restored the Henderson place. They brought me vegetables from their gardens, invited me to community dinners, and shared stories about my grandmother, who'd apparently been well respected despite her reclusive nature. One neighbor, a woman named Alice, who ran the local hardware store, told me something that made me understand my grandmother better. "Margaret was a good woman," Alice said, "but she lived with a lot of regret. She told me once that she'd driven her daughter away by being too rigid, too controlling. Said she'd learned too late that loving someone sometimes means letting them go, even when it breaks your heart." A year after moving to the farm, I held my own art show at Catherine's Gallery. It was much smaller than my mother's retrospective, just 15 paintings I'd completed over the previous months. I didn't expect to sell anything. I just wanted to see my work on a wall, to feel what my mother must have felt showing her art to the world. To my shock, 7 paintings sold. The reviews were kind but honest, noting that I showed promise but was still developing my voice. That felt exactly right. I was finding my way, building on my mother's legacy while creating something uniquely mine. I used the money from my sales to start a scholarship fund for young artists from low-income backgrounds, kids who had talent but no resources. I called it the Sarah Foster Memorial Art Scholarship. The first recipient was a 15-year-old girl from the group home where I'd lived, a talented painter who reminded me of my mother. On the second anniversary of finding the barn, I invited everyone who mattered to the farm for a celebration. Catherine came, along with several collectors who'd bought my mother's work. Alice and other neighbors showed up with covered dishes. Even Miss Patricia from the group home drove up, proud of how far I'd come. We gathered in the barn, surrounded by the remaining paintings I'd kept, the ones too personal to sell. I gave a short speech, thanking everyone for supporting me and for honoring my mother's memory. 2 years ago, I said, I thought I had nothing, no family, no future, no connection to anything bigger than myself. Then I got a letter about property taxes on a farm I didn't know I owned, and it changed everything. My mother and grandmother gave me more than just land. They gave me a legacy of creativity, of resilience, of women who refused to let circumstances define them. I held up the iron key that had started it all. My grandmother left me this key with instructions to use it when I was ready. I thought I'd find answers in the barn. Instead, I found questions. Who was my mother before she was my mom? Who was my grandmother behind her stern exterior? Who am I when I'm connected to their story? I'm still figuring that out, but I know now that I come from artists and dreamers. I come from women who loved fiercely even when they couldn't show it in traditional ways. And I'm committed to honoring that legacy by creating, by supporting other artists, and by keeping this farm as a place where creativity and healing can coexist. Everyone applauded, and we spent the rest of the evening eating, laughing, and sharing stories. As the sun set over the fields, I stood on the porch of the farmhouse, the same porch where my mother had stood as a young woman, painting the landscape she loved. I finally understood why she'd left and why my grandmother had let her go. Sometimes love means giving people the freedom to choose their own path, even when it takes them away from you. My mother had chosen to raise me in the city, to give me opportunities the farm couldn't offer. My grandmother had chosen to respect that decision, even though it meant losing daily contact with the people she loved most. And now I'd chosen to return to the farm, to build a life that honored both of them while being authentically mine. I was an artist like my mother, but I was also a curator, a student, a community member. I was creating a life that blended their dreams with my own. The farm that no one wanted, the property that had nearly been seized for unpaid taxes, had become my sanctuary. The barn lock that had seemed like just another obstacle had been the key to understanding my entire history. I think about that sometimes, how a simple piece of metal, an old key with a cryptic note, had unlocked not just a door, but an entire legacy. How close I'd come to never knowing any of this, to going through life believing I came from nothing and no one. But I did come from someone. I came from artists and fighters. I came from women who loved imperfectly but deeply. And now I had the chance to carry that forward, to add my own chapter to a story that had started generations before I was born. As winter approached and I prepared for my second year on the farm, I felt something I'd never experienced in the group home or my dingy apartment. I felt home, not just in the physical sense of having a place to live, but in the deeper meaning of belonging to something larger than myself. The farm would always be here, weathering seasons and storms, holding the memories of the women who'd shaped it. And I would be here too, painting in the barn, tending the land, and making sure that the legacy of creativity and resilience continued. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel. We share real stories about unexpected discoveries, family secrets, and finding where you truly belong. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you saw yourself? Or maybe you've inherited something that turned out to be more valuable than money? I read every comment, and your stories inspire me. And don't forget to check out the other videos on screen. Until next time, remember that sometimes the things we inherit aren't just objects. They're entire worlds waiting to be discovered.